All right, welcome everybody. Been good to talk about how things are going here this week in our lives and in Michigan with the fall coming on quickly. Sounds like the weather forecast is going to be pretty nasty for the next couple of days. So we're happy that we can come together and look at the Word together. And tonight, thinking about the Beatitudes. I mentioned in the email that Pastor Joel has been speaking about worldview, and if there's anything that sort of comes upside our head with worldview, it's the Beatitudes. Beatitudes really show us what the kingdom of God is all about and what it means to follow the Lord and the values of his reign in our lives. So if you're looking at our notes, page 12, we're thinking first of all about defining what a beatitude is, and it's a promise of a blessing. It's not a legal requirement. That is to say that we shouldn't read these beatitudes as sort of God throwing down the gauntlet to us and saying, if you want to go to heaven, here's the list of characteristics that you have to somehow put into your life. And if you're good enough that these characteristics, if you got more positive marks on the right side of the page and you have negative marks on the left side of the page, you'll be admitted to heaven. So we shouldn't read them that, if you work hard enough and do these things, you'll get in. So when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's not saying you better be poor in spirit or you won't get in. He's saying if you have truly begun to follow Christ, if you're listening to the kingdom message in terms of Matthew, that would be John the Baptist in 3:2 and Jesus in 4:17, both saying, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So if this is your desire in life to turn and follow the new message of Jesus, then this is what God has done in your life. He has made you a person who has acknowledged your spiritual poverty. You are a person who, second beatitude, who has learned to mourn over your sin and the sin of the world and all the problems that are in the world. You've recognized that before God, you have to be a meek person. You've recognized...
David, could I interfere real quick? Carol needs to be let in.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Here we go. Looks like we have the Reamers coming in too here. Thanks for pointing that out. Mm-hmm. Once I start talking, I forget to look at that little menu on the side. So welcome, Reamers and Carol.
Thank you.
So we're thinking about what Beatitudes are. They're not like God challenging us to somehow be what they describe. They're basically saying if you have begun to follow Jesus, these are the things that you have taken on yourself through the gospel. And it's not that we are automatically meek and mourning for the sin of the world. And it's not that we're automatically characterized by all these things, but God has made a change in us. And now we are, at least in principle, manifesting these characteristics. And now by his grace, we try to practice them more consistently. So each one of these are basically a statement of God's approval, and then they're followed by the reason for God's approval. So if we take the second one, for example, blessed are those who mourn, that sort of sounds like counterintuitive. Why would you say someone is happy who's mourning? Because though they are mourning now, they will be comforted in the future. So we have the statement of blessing followed by the reason. And a very similar way of expressing things for the opposite reason are all the times in the Bible where it says, woe to you. For example, in Matthew 23, Jesus says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and he has 7 of those there, and they're following the same form. And they sort of put, I guess you'd say, almost like bookends on the teaching of Jesus, because he pronounces the blessing upon those who are following him, who've adopted the values of the kingdom, who put their faith in him. And those who rebel against Jesus, he pronounces the woes against them in Matthew 23. And together they sort of frame the whole teaching of Jesus in Matthew. So we need to sort of compare the woes to the Beatitudes and realize they're pretty much the mere opposite of each other, but they have the same type of literary form. Do you have any thoughts or questions about how the Beatitudes work, just as a way of speaking? Well, we turn next in the notes to how they fit together. And I call attention to the fact that you may have noticed in verses 3 and 10, the reason for the blessing is the same. It says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or words to that effect, depending on what translation you're using. So there's something about the presence of the kingdom there. But all the Beatitudes in between the first and the last, the middle six, if you want to call it that, they talk about blessing as a future possession. For example, it says they shall be comforted, or they shall inherit the kingdom, or they shall be satisfied. Words to that effect. So it's interesting how the Beatitudes sort of mirror what we were saying about the kingdom of God in our previous session, that the kingdom of God is already here in reality, even though it's not yet fully here. So we have already become, by the power of the Holy Spirit, submissive to the reign of God in our lives. Christ is Lord. We're not always perfectly submissive to Christ's reign. We still have our problems, and we're in process. So it's the old button that people used to wear a while back, please be patient, God isn't finished with me yet, except it just had the first letter of each of those words. Mm-hmm. Well, he isn't finished with us yet, but he has started. I think of the U2 song about I'm still haven't found what I'm looking for. That doesn't mean that everything is chaos and there's no meaning in life when you listen to the song and read the lyric. The lyric said, lyric says, I believe in the kingdom come and all that, and I trust in that, but I still haven't found it yet. So that's sort of the attitude, I think, of the Beatitudes in many ways. The Beatitudes are speaking to people who've already tasted of God's reign and have begun to follow the lordship of Christ, but they're not totally there yet. And I think the one that probably expresses that the most clearly is in verse 6, where it says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We still haven't found what we're looking for, in the sense that we're not by a long shot perfect yet, but we don't just sit back and lounge and rest on our eternal security. Hopefully, we realize that what God has begun in us, he'll complete. And in the meantime, we're seriously applying ourselves with a passion for God, and we're pursuing his righteousness, and we're attempting to become more like Christ every day. So this way in which the Beatitudes speak of the reign of God as both present and future is, I think, one of the most theologically profound things about them. And you notice the last one in verse 10, which really sort of comes as a surprise, after saying that the merciful will receive mercy, the pure in heart will see God, and the peacemakers will be called the children of God. To hear it said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So it seems like, if you are following Christ and doing all these wonderful things in the world, then people are going to pat you on the back. Maybe we think that's coming our way and we should have it, but not necessarily. So if you manifest all these wonderful kingdom values and live in a way that the culture around you doesn't like, it's not your intention to say, show them up or make them look bad, but perhaps you do unintentionally just by being like Christ. And if that occurs, then you may be persecuted for righteousness' sake. So persecution is the final beatitude. And you'll notice in verses 11 and 12, it's the only one that sort of gets an expanded treatment. It starts off in verse 11 with another, sounds like a beatitude, but it goes on and on and on. But you have to get into verse 12 before you get the reason. So blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you on my account. Rejoice and be glad. So that's all the first part of the beatitude. Second, here's the second part. Here's the reason. For, middle of verse 12, your reward is great in heaven. And there's even another reason, for they persecuted the prophets who were before you, just like this. So there's a long thing about the blessedness, and there's a double reason instead of a single one. So I wonder whether this emphasis on persecution at the end of the Beatitudes shows that this is the context for all the others. In other words, when it begins by saying in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, these are people who are not just physically impoverished. They are people who are indeed physically impoverished, but they're trusting in God to help them and in God alone. Why is that? Why are they poor? Perhaps because of persecution. When you look at verse 4, why are they mourning? Perhaps because of the effect of persecution in their lives. Why are they meek? Well, probably because the persecutors hold all the power and they don't have any capacity to push back. They're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. In verse 6, we tend to translate the word here, righteousness, and think of it as personal righteousness. And maybe we read Matthew 5 through the lens of Paul's teaching. When we see the word righteousness, we think of the doctrine of justification, and we see Paul's rich teaching about how Christ put himself in our place. He took our condemnation, and we receive his righteousness on a personal basis. That's the central Protestant doctrine of justification. That's great. We believe that. I certainly do. But perhaps here it's not so much speaking about that as it's speaking about practical righteousness, actual righteous behavior. And the word also implies justice beyond just the personal level, probably to the social level. So we thirst for righteousness, meaning not only that we want to see godly people, we want to be more godly ourselves, but we want to see godly systems in the world. We want to see godly people taking care of the politics, godly people taking care of the government. We want to see godliness and righteousness manifest itself not just in people's individual lives, but in their relationships and in the social government, indeed, all over the world. So we're looking for righteousness in the fullest sense of the word. Not just that we have a just standing before God because Christ died for us, but in addition to that, we want to see the world full of just people who treat each other justly as well. And you don't have to read too far on in the newspaper if you still read that outmoded device, or if you check your favorite websites to get your news. You realize the world is not a righteous place, and sometimes it just it makes you feel like crying when you see all the horrible things that are going on. So think about all that when you see about people who are mourning and people who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness' sake.
David,
yes.
Could you let Sturkins in?
Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Thought I already clicked that once. Hi, Carol.
Jake.
Sorry for the delay.
Oh, well, now I can't figure out how to.
Let him in.
Yeah, so I sent a couple messages to you, one to Beverly and one to Barb Reamer, and I was trying to think now, who else is in the class?
I just got it too, so yeah.
Your best bet. That's all right. Better late than never. And your best bet is probably to send it to Beverly, not me, because I'm not paying a lot of attention once I start talking. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thanks for letting me in. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry for the delay. So these are some ideas about how the Beatitudes fit together, with the final one getting the most emphasis and perhaps being the explanation for the situation that all the others address. And there's this little section at the end of the Beatitudes, verses 13 through 16, that's sort of a hinge or a transition into the next main section. And I think sometimes it gets a little bit lost in the shuffle. And that's the words that we have heard oftentimes about salt and light. And I think salt and light is a very interesting way to think about the effects of people who are walking beatitudes, who are living in light of these values. When we begin to live in a way that counters the cultural values, and we begin to, rub elbows with people in the world who have a different value system, we can't help but be salt and light. I think salt doesn't work unless you get it out of the shaker and mix it in with the food. And light doesn't work unless it's keeps itself separate from everything else. We have a lamp in the ceiling of the house, not down in the floor in a corner somewhere. So it has to have a prominent spot. And in some ways, to me, this sort of separates, pictures the way different Christians see the way they have testimony in the world. And I think I shared this with the small group the other day, so a few of you folks have heard this before. This is about the only place our two studies are going to intersect on this occasion this evening, so don't think this is going to be repetitious the rest of the time. But it seems to me in West Michigan especially, we know from the influence of the Dutch Reformed community that the motto of that community is that Christ transforms culture. And when Reformed Christians are at their best, they are engaged with the world, attempting to have a Christian influence in all the world's systems. The Baptist community is also rather strong in West Michigan, the independent Bible church type community, the lower church Protestants. And it seems like their heritage, their calling card, if you will, is a bit more toward the idea that Christians should be separate from the world and should, have a godly witness to the world from outside of the world's systems and the world's organizations. So it seems to me that both of these groups have a biblical mandate to do what they're doing. I think, if you read in Matthew chapter 9, you can see how Matthew himself came to follow Christ. And it's the familiar story about how Jesus was coming by Matthew's tax office, his toll booth, where he collected taxes. And Jesus said, "Hey, follow me," just out of the blue, amazingly. So by the grace of God, Matthew did. And very soon after that, there was a dinner party at Matthew's house. So Matthew invited all his tax collector buddies, and Jesus and all the apostles were there. And the religious leaders of the Jews didn't like it. They said he receives sinners and he eats with them. So Jesus, all that leads up for Jesus teaching about the people who are not sick don't need a doctor. I've come to call sinners. So Jesus, in a very perfect way, modeled contact with sinners without being contaminated by them. And you could say, infiltrated them, but he didn't assimilate with them. Those were the words I used in the notes to try to, turn a phrase to illustrate what I'm talking about here. And that is that we need to be around people, or we can't be a witness to them, like salt has to be, seasoned into the stew. But at the same time, though, we have to be light when we are put into the stew. We have to maintain our own identity, or we sort of get lost in the shuffle, and our light is hidden under the bushel basket. So this, I think, takes a huge amount of wisdom, and I know for one, I sure need a lot more than I have currently, and I just think it's a good aspiration for all of us to think about in that respect. So we've been talking about how the Beatitudes fit together and how they tie into what follows briefly. So what do you think? Any thoughts or questions at this point? Comments? You're not going to make me do all the talking tonight, are you? Come on.
So our church is a Baptist by history, but I think we have, in fact, Pastor Cole used to talk a lot about, how they would just build fences to keep away from the world. And I think we have done a good job of teaching us that we need to be a part of things and get, be active in the community without actually assimilating and acting like them. But you mentioned the Baptist history, so I thought, well, we are a Baptist church by history, but they have let go a lot of that stuff.
Well, in some cases, the Baptists get a bad name worse than they deserve, but there are a few who richly deserve the bad name, and I guess the rest of us get tarred with the same brush sometimes. But I think, yeah, I think the participation and help with the public school system is one area where there's good community engagement, and there's probably others that I don't know about that people have individually. And so that's the thing. How are we going to bear witness for Christ if we're just bearing witness for Christ to each other?
Yeah.
You know, we need to encourage each other in the faith, and that's a good thing. But once we've encouraged each other in the faith, then we leave the Christian community to live in the world at large, and we go to work, we join the civic clubs, perhaps we do other things in the community, and we take our kingdom values with us in all those activities, and hopefully bear witness for Christ in everything we do.
Can you repeat what you said about the Reformed?
What was it?
Will you repeat what you said about the Reformed?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that at least in the tradition of history going back in the Dutch Reformed circles, especially to people like Abraham Kuyper, Kuyper is famously quoted as saying that when Christ looks at the whole created world, there's not an inch of it that isn't his. And it's a much more eloquent quote than I just summarized it, but I think it's something to the effect that when Christ looks at the world, every little bit of it, he says, mine. In other words, there's nothing in this entire world that he created that does not belong to him and doesn't submit to his lordship eventually. In other words, Christ will rule someday. Wherever the sun shines, he will rule. He made the world, and humans have taken it for, you know, a ride in the wrong direction, but he's the one who still claims it to be his own. And according to the scripture, ultimately we'll have new heavens and new earth, Revelation 21 and 22, and Christ will reign over a transformed world. So the idea would be that in the meantime, Christ's people, the church, live in the world in such a way to make perhaps small but genuine transforming actions in their individual lives. If we can go from the sublime Abraham Kuyper to the ridiculous, the child's hymn, you're supposed to brighten the corner where you are. Maybe that's not so ridiculous. But that's what the salt thing is about. And what I'm saying is that I think the Reformed people perhaps get the salt metaphor and the Baptists maybe get the light metaphor. But we need both. We need to be in contact with people in the world and not hold ourselves to be too holy to be around them. But we need to, when we are around people who don't know the Lord, we're out in the larger culture, we need to make sure that we show the culture our true identity in Christ, and don't be afraid to manifest these kingdom characteristics that we're looking at here to them. So perhaps maybe in the providence of God, the Reformed salt and the Baptist light overall makes the right impression. I don't know. What do you think of that? What do you think of that idea that the Reformed people get the salt and the more fundamentalist lower church people get the light? Does that make any sense, or is that just off the wall?
There's
Well,
a lot of, sorry, there's a lot of influence. There's a lot of Reformed influence, I think, in this area.
That's right, and that's sort of why I made the comment, because we see a lot of that. We see the educational institutions, particularly in West Michigan, that are very strong in forming people for entering into different vocations and professions. And I think, you know, I have great respect for it myself, and I hope you do too.
I think it's a good combination.
I'm told back in the day, Dr. David Otis Fuller used to share pulpits, used to swap back and forth with whoever the gentleman was who was the pastor of, what was it, Central Reformed Church in downtown Grand Rapids. And the choirs used to go back and forth from one church to the other, and they'd switch choirs once in a while and stuff like that. So it seemed like maybe there was a little bit more cooperation back in the day than there is now. I don't know.
So would you say that Reformed Baptist has it all together?
Yeah, I don't know. I personally have a lot of leanings toward Reformed theology, not in the area of church polity with infant baptism, and my view of the end of time, the end times is premillennial. Most Reformed people are amillennial, though not all by any means. So I think perhaps you could say the Reformed Baptists have the best of both worlds. Or you might say, if you don't like them, that they're trying to put together apples and oranges, and they're trying to create something that should never be put together. I wouldn't say that, but some might. Yeah. Anyway, let's go on. I want us to think about each of the Beatitudes in some detail as we move toward page 13. We already talked about, to some extent, the point at the bottom of page 12 of the notes, to the effect that the kingdom of heaven involves something God is already doing. He's already come to reign in our lives through the gospel's power and through the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. So we've already tasted of God's kingdom. Theirs is the kingdom. On the other hand, we don't yet fully possess the kingdom. Chapter 5, verse 5, for instance, says they will inherit the earth. We have not yet inherited the earth, obviously. We may own a home on one little postage stamp sized piece of the earth, but we haven't inherited the earth by any means. But someday Jesus is going to come back to rule and reign what he created and what he died on the cross to purchase. So in that glorious event, we will share. So the kingdom is both present and future. I think we've talked about that quite a bit, so we won't belabor the point unless you'd like to do that. So unless you have other comments to make, I'd like us to look at page 13 and think about the values that the Beatitudes stress, and just sort of self-consciously reflect on how they're different than much of the world around us. For instance, starts off by saying, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So if you read the corresponding beatitude in Luke chapter 6, Luke doesn't say in spirit. Some people have made a big difference between Matthew's poor in spirit and Luke's just simple poor. I don't think they're really two different ideas. I think Matthew just makes explicit what Luke implies. What Luke is saying that Matthew makes more clear is that the people who are so deprived of earthly goods that their only trust is in God, and they totally, absolutely depend on God to meet their needs because they don't have a social security check. They don't have family they can trust to help them. They're basically destitute apart from the grace of God. So I think it's talking about absolute dependence upon God. And these are the people who have really possessed the kingdom today. These are the people who really understand what it means to walk with God and to totally trust him for everything. So this perhaps is, at the beginning of the Beatitudes, the most jarring one of them all. And when you first read that, you think, are you kidding me, Jesus? This is a joke, right? You're saying the poor are the ones who are blessed. And Jesus' disciples probably were just as shocked as we are today, because you might remember in Matthew 19 when the fellow we call the rich young ruler came to speak to Jesus. And Jesus mentioned to him several commandments, which he said he had kept. Remember the story, right? And Jesus said, all right, then, if you think you've kept the law, then sell everything that you own and give it away and follow me. Because if you have truly kept God's law and you hold him to be the king of your life and you have no other gods before him, then you ought to be willing to give up everything you have to follow Jesus. And it says the young man went away sorrowful because he had many possessions. I like to hope that he realized that he needed to repent and get rid of his riches, which were his idols. And I like to think that perhaps he eventually did come and follow Jesus. We don't know. And I guess that's why the story stops there, to keep us guessing. and perhaps to make us wonder about our own lives. We might not consider ourselves to be rich, but by world standards, by and large, with a lot of people in a lot of other countries, I think we are rich. But I won't get off on that. So do you remember what the disciples said after the rich young man went away? Jesus said, riches can block you from getting into heaven. It's difficult for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples were amazed. They said, who then can be saved? Because in their view, riches were a clear sign of God's favor. If you were a godly person, then you would perhaps consider yourself, very fortunate and very blessed. And maybe we would then look back to, say, the book of Job and see how Job was certainly an extremely wealthy person by ancient as well as modern standards. And the devil tempted Job with God's permission and basically said, the only reason he follows you, Lord, is because he's prosperous. And if you take away his goods, he won't follow you anymore. And, 40 chapters later, we find out at the end that Job did, maintain his integrity before God, and God brought him through all that and blessed him with material possessions all over again, which God was under no obligation to do. So we do have an assumption, perhaps, in the wider culture in which we live yet today, that if someone is well off, it's due to God's blessing in their life. Or perhaps maybe we are jealous of people like that, and we think they got where they are by stealing from other people, or by shady business dealings, or underworld connections, or whatever. So what do you think the voices of our culture are today about riches when it comes to the approval of God?
I think if you make your riches an idol, that's the problem. But if you are blessed with riches, but yet have all the other attributes of the Beatitudes, you can still be a blessing. You can still serve the Lord. And I think the rich young ruler probably didn't want to give up anything and make that was his idol. His riches were his idol. Just a guess.
Yeah.
Isn't more asked of the rich too, as far as giving away to the poor and to donate it to charity? Isn't there a verse that talks about more being required of the
Who much is been given,
much is given?
Much is
Right.
Yeah.
Much is required.
I don't know if that's just talking about money though. It might be talking about other things.
Oh yeah, probably everything that we have, but
Like who we are. And,
It's an interesting point, because then you wonder who defines the much,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, how do you know what that much is? And
Not just anybody who has more than I have.
exactly what I was thinking.
So I think that to whom much is given, much will be required is a very general thing, and it would certainly include, the stewardship of whatever we have, and however much we have, and even when we compare ourselves to others, which is unwise, but we do it all the time. Someone else has something newer than ours, and so we have to rush in and upgrade our possession, and then maybe they look at us and say, well, theirs is newer than ours, so we got to go upgrade ours now. So it's a rat race, and obviously it never really gets you anywhere. What just shows the folly of thinking that your relationship to God is somehow dependent upon how much you have in your bank account, or however many possessions you have.
I find it very fascinating of the amount of money that we have. For example, you're probably all into computers and things, and how much Microsoft software that you bought from Bill Gates.
No.
And we've made him a very rich man. And later in his life now, he is actually giving a lot of the money that we have given to him into all his charitable causes. And it's almost like a big circle. He's made so much money from the people, he needs to give it away to what we hope are charitable causes, to those people who are really in need over in Africa. And I just find it very fascinating what rich people are doing with their money. So some are just hoarding it and buying basketball teams and football teams, but there are some philanthropists who are actually giving back to the world and the community. Now, some people may think it's not right or whatever, but I just kind of find it fascinating how the rich are just kind of, some of them are just giving back.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. So when you think about it, the sad thing is that some folks who are rich are using their riches in a very positive way in their communities.
Yes.
And sometimes people who are poor are very envious, covetous of other people's possessions. And so their heart isn't where it needs to be otherwise. So it's not simply how much we have, it's the attitude with which we have it and we exercise our stewardship over it. So if you want to look up an interesting passage on this, we won't take the time, but if you want to look something up, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 to 19 is how Paul addressed people who are rich. And basically he's telling them you shouldn't be proud. And you should use your substance to help other people and store up treasure in heaven, not just on earth. And that sounds quite a bit like Matthew 6 to me, that little bit in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 19. Did I say chapter 5 in 1 Timothy? I should have said chapter 6. 1 Timothy 6, 17 and following. So let me move on. The second beatitude is about mourning. So again, you say, well, how could you be blessed when you're mourning? And we have cultural voices around us that tell us what we really need to be is, happy-go-lucky, joyful, exuberant. So, if you're not walking around with springs in your shoes and just jumping for joy and happy all the time about this or that, then there's something wrong with you. And I think some Christians sort of play into that as well sometimes. They seem to think that if you're not constantly have a big smile on your face and, ready to testify to all the wonderful things Jesus did for you this morning, you're not a very spiritual person. I think we have those days now and then where something wonderful happens and we do feel like we need to, sort of stop smiling so widely or we'll split our face open. But that's not necessarily always a mark of true spirituality. So there are times when we need to take very seriously the problems that the world has, not only in our own sad circumstances that we all face at one time or another, but just at the state of the world, at the state of our community. I mean, just look at your favorite TV station's website each morning, and you're probably going to see that somebody got shot here, or somebody, got in a fight there. There was a horrible car wreck, and a drunk driver killed a baby, or something. We see horrible things all the time that lead us to mourn over the status of the world and to hunger and thirst for a greater righteousness in the world. So the voices we hear from culture, perhaps even sometimes some Christian subcultures, make it seem like we should just be happy-go-lucky all the time. That's not what Jesus taught, I'm afraid. So he goes on to say, those of us who hunger and thirst after righteousness are blessed. That doesn't sound like the voices I hear from the world. The voices I hear from the world are that you need to seek more pleasure. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst after, a larger house, a faster car, a longer boat, a longer vacation, more money to spend in the casino, you name it. So this is very contrary to what we typically hear around us. It says, blessed are those who are merciful. They will receive mercy. So showing mercy to people who are needy. Often we would think that you're blessed when you don't have any contact with merciful situations. Why would I want to even hang out with people who need mercy? They'll just drag me down into their sad situation. So I'd be better off if I were just removed from that and going about my own way of life and continuing my own success. But Jesus said we need to hang out with people who need mercy and to show it to them. So again, it's very, very different than the selfish, prideful way that we typically see things taught to us in the world. So I could go on and talk about purity in heart. It's interesting that he says, blessed are the pure in heart, not those who simply are pure perhaps in carrying out the various rituals that the Jews carried out. You might remember in the Gospel of John at the wedding at Cana, Jesus turned the water into wine there. They had lots of water around so that everybody could purify themselves. They could take their ceremonial washing of their hands and all that. And I'm not saying that in itself is an evil thing, but unless we think about the purity internal to us in our heart, whether we wash our hands or not is really a moot point. It doesn't much matter. And he talks about the peacemakers being blessed, and ultimately those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So I think you see what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to point out that when you look at all these 8 Beatitudes, they're all pretty much countercultural, and even more sad to say, they're somewhat counter nominal Christian culture. There are churches today of various stripes that are very opposite to what these things are saying too about their values. And so what do you think of this? Does it sort of make you think that this whole Christian life thing is really a sad, dreary experience? You go around with a long face, or what does all this mean to you when you read it?
Tells me this is a journey and not a destination.
Good point.
Yeah.
There certainly is a destination, and there's, is the kingdom of heaven. We've already got it in sight. We shall inherit the earth, but it's a long way off. So in the meantime, what's the other cliche? Keep your eye on the prize.
Mm-hmm.
There certainly is a prize. We don't have it yet. We can see it in the distance.
It's a good reminder for how we should live. That's for sure.
I think it goes back to the point where that you were talking about a separation of salt and light. That if we're looking at these, you can't separate salt and light from a Christian life. And the influence that we have as salt in people's lives comes from that mixing, from that work, from the mixing of groups with people and everything. The light is how that we're going to act within those groups. And if our light is not shining and it's visible to people, then our salt isn't going to do any good. one word can tear down our whole testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just take a minute and give you a couple of examples here of a second in this. One, as a teacher, I was at a party one time for staff, and I had a cup of Vernors. And Vernors looks like beer. And one of the guys comes up and says, "Thought you were a good Christian. Here you are with a cup of beer." Okay. I set it down and walked away because that guy was really looking. He was always looking for an excuse to do something, say something. And then another example of salt and light, one of our pastors that started the church that we were members of in Chesnee, his family lived in Washington, and they walked to church, and they passed by this house, and they revisited that home, and I don't remember exactly when they were out walking, but the people said, "Hey, we watched you go Sunday after Sunday to church. People watch us." And so if that salt and light is separated, then we're not living the life that Christ is expecting of us there.
Yeah.
And, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Well, the Vernors story is an interesting story. I guess I don't make the assumption that Christians are teetotalers necessarily. I know some in good conscience are, and some in good conscience are not.
Yeah.
But it's more telling, I guess, of the person who was criticizing you for what he thought was the grain-based beverage, rather than the Vernors in your hand. That tells you about a person who was looking for excuses to put Christians down, I guess, to begin with. So
He was.
Yeah.
He was. That was him.
so you should have said, I'm not criticizing you, Ron, but you should have said, "Well, want a taste of this beer?"
Oh, I did.
This is really good beer. You should try one.
I did. I said, "You want to taste it, Lyle?" And he goes, "No."
Mm-hmm.
But it was that thing,
Yeah. Well, I think probably you probably were living the sort of life before him for many months, perhaps years. I don't know how long you knew the man, but you probably had been shedding light upon him and pouring salt on him for some time before that, and he was just looking for aha, I got him now type of thing. So our time's coming to an end, and I don't mind hanging around a little bit if you like afterwards, but I do want to honor the 7:30 time limit for those of you who need to go. But I just want to point out that one of the Beatitudes, of course, is based on the meek inheriting the earth, and that comes out of Psalm 24. So I thought I'd read a few verses from Psalm 24, beginning at verse 3. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who will stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, or swear deceitfully. He will receive the blessing of the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. And there's a verse that I'm sure you've heard before in Micah chapter 6 that I think also really sums up the spirituality of the Beatitudes very well. Micah 6, beginning at verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So many of those values there, I think, are what Jesus was referring to when he was speaking in the Beatitudes. What he's speaking about here is deeply rooted in the Old Testament. And I think when we look next week at the rest of Matthew 5, verses 17 to 48, where Jesus says, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill the law of Moses, we will see even more how his teaching is not meant to be a gracious teaching that will replace a legalistic one, but that his teaching is what Moses has been saying all along. And it's not Jesus who is got a different idea than Moses. It is the religious leaders who claim they're following Moses. They're the ones who have missed it and who are leading Israel astray. So that's it for this evening. So next week it's Matthew 5:17 through 48, and we'll see you then. And I'm willing